So, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about penetration testing and some of the details around how it works and logistics and specifically things like scope. So, what exactly is penetration testing? So, well, not surprisingly, it's testing to see if you can penetrate something, which means you're going to check to see whether you can break into a particular thing, whether it's a server or in applications, depending on the type of engagement you've got. You may have the ability to try to break in physically to a location, but primarily what you're going to be doing with penetration testing is you're going to be trying to break into systems and networks and applications, and that's the kind of what it's all about. And this may actually involve social engineering attacks. So it may require you to make a phone call to somebody and get them to give you their username and password, or some other type of social engineering attack, where maybe you send a URL via a crafted email. Sometimes it's just strictly a technical approach where you're running scans and you're running Metasploit and you're gaining access. That way, or maybe some other type of technical application sort of connection. Sometimes it's physical access that you need. So, in order to get access to a particular system, if you can get physical access, then maybe you can get in. So, that was all about that's what exactly penetration testing is. It's checking whether you can get into a system, whether it be physically or on a network. So, what are the goals of penetration testing? The goals would be to assess weakness in an organization's security postures. You want to figure out what they're vulnerable so that they can go and fix these problems. You want to help them understand their risk positions better and what they can or may be able to do to mitigate those risks. And ultimately, you want to be able to access systems in a particular way to find weaknesses. So, those are really sort of the goals of penetration testing. Now, from a results standpoint, when you're done your testing, what you are going to do, well, you're probably going to generate a report. And by that, I don't mean you're going to run some automated tool and you're going to get it to generate a report for you. You're actually going to give that to the client. You're actually going to give your report to the client. And then they're going to write you a really large check. So that's not really how it works. You're going to write a report detailing the findings in a detailed way so that it includes what did you do to find out what you actually found out and how you can actually mitigate that particular risk. So you should really include remediation activities in order to fix these vulnerabilities that you find. And it's pretty easy to walk around saying, hey, that's a problem and that's a problem and that's a problem. That's really not a lot of value in that where there's a value is that, hey, that's a problem and here's how you can go about fixing it. So let's talk about the scope of penetration testing. So firstly, you want to actually realize how big is the breadbox and how specifically what is it that the two of you have agreed that being you, the ethical hacker, and the other guy being the authorized person to give you permissions to ethically hack, have specifically agreed that you can do penetration testing and you can target them as an organization or the client. And what you have agreed to are any exclusions or any sort of areas that they say you're not allowed to touch. So anything so, like if they've got a database server maybe, or there's a lot of really sensitive data on it, and there's a little hesitant, and they may put a don't touch this thing clause in the scope. So there are a lot of different reasons why they may exclude areas from the scope, and if they exclude them, then trust their reason and listen to them. What they have to say in terms of this is what we want you to accomplish. So along those lines, you really need to get sign off from the target organization. Now, we've talked about this before, and this is certainly all about the ethics and trust, and it's also about legality because if you do something that you don't have permissions to do, you could be prosecuted for that. So, definitely get the scope very clear in writing and with signatures attached to it as to what you can and what you can't do, and always get approval from the right people and make sure you get somebody who has the right level of permissions and is the right level of management so that they can sign off on its understanding and accept the risk that is associated with a penetration test. So, let me talk a little bit about security assessments and how they differ from penetration tests. The security assessment is a hand in hand approach with clients. So, you would walk in doing a collaborative thing where you're a trusted partner and you ally with them, and your goal isn't to penetrate them and point out all the things that are really bad, but it's to get a full assessment of the risk that the organization is exposed to, and you would probably provide more details about fixes that maybe you would in a penetration test. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to walk in and make sure that the policies and procedures they have in place are really what they need for the organization. and the risk appetite that they've got. And we're going to make sure that the policies and procedures have controls that can tell us whether they are being actually adhered to or not. So the procedures and policies are being followed. A security assessment is probably a little bit more comprehensive than a penetration test, and you would look at more factors to assess the security postures of the organization in their overall risk. And you would tailor the output based on their risk appetite and what they're most interested in. And that's not to say that I'm going to tell them what they want to hear, but if there's something that they know and I know that they're just not going to do, I'm not going to be making a big deal out of it because they're already aware of it. And I'll make a note of it in the report just for a completeness sake. But I'm not going to go out in a lot of detail, so it's really kind of a hand in hand collaborative approach where again, you're not just saying that they want us to say we're providing some real security and risk guidance towards their activities and other things. So it may provide an unrealistic view. So you've got a week, let's say, to do this penetration test against your target. Now you're going to have to go in, you're going to have to get set up, you're also going to have to start doing a bunch of scans and make sure that you're gathering information and screenshots and data for your reports. You're going to have to do all sorts of activities also during the course of that week. You're going to be engaged in probably beginning to write your report and getting a sense of what is going to say and what's going to be in it. If you don't actually get any major penetration during the course of that week, the organization may feel like they're quote unquote secure. That's one of the reasons why penetration testing, while really sexy and show, is nice and all, but if an organization walks out of it believing that in a week you didn't manage to get the keys of the kingdom, then they must be secure. That's really a misguided view because a dedicated, skilled, and motivated attacker isn't going to just take a week or some portion of that week. If they're after something, they're going to dedicate themselves to it and really go after it. So just because you didn't find a penetration in some subset of a week doesn't mean that they're secure and invulnerable to attacks. It just means that during the course of that particular week and other circumstances that were in place, you didn't get a penetration that was really significant or major. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. And if an organization walks away feeling like they're secure, they're going to end up not fixing the real vulnerabilities that may be in place that could expose them to significant risks. So that's penetration testing, its scopes, its goals, and how it differs to security assessments. Now it's time to go over footprinting. So, what is footprinting? Well, footprinting is getting an idea of the entire scope of your target. That means not just the scope that you were given, which may be an address block or it may be a domain name, that even may be a set of address blocks. Now, what you want to do is you want to figure out all the information that's associated with that in great detail as you can possibly get. So, you want a list of domain names as you're going to go through this. You probably want some sort of database or Excel spreadsheet or something to keep track of all the information because you're going to have a lot of it at the end. You want to be able to find the information quickly. So having some sort of either notepad going with your notes or, as I said, a spreadsheet or a database. So if you can get organized in that way, you want to keep all those sorts of things down. So in this case, I want to do some sort of search on, suppose, let's say edureka.co. Now I need network blocks. So far we found out that just made up IP addresses because I'm just putting information down. But I need network blocks. So you may have one IP address that you can find externally, or you're going to want a whole range of internal blocks, and you can do a little bit of digging if you aren't provided those. You want specific IP addresses for critical systems, web servers, email servers, databases, if you can find any of these things of those sorts. And you want system architectures. And what kind of stuff are they running? Are they running Intel? Are they running Windows? Are they running some Unix systems? What are they running? What kind of access control list they have? These are going to be hard to get, but you may be able to guess them. And you can guess these by doing port scans. So what sort of responses you get back from the port scans with the filters and or what you don't get back will tell you about if there's an IDS around or some you want to do a system enumeration or you can get access to a system somehow. You want to know usernames, group names, so on. So the basic idea of footprinting is gathering information. Now, if you can get access to systems somehow, you want to know usernames, group names. So you want system banners, routine tables, SNMP information if you can get it, DNS host names if you can get those. So now this is for both internal and external on the side. If you're doing an internal penetration test or ethical hacking engagement, you want to know the networking protocols that are there. Are they using TCP/IP, or are they using some UDP, or are they on IPX or SPX? Are they using DECnet or AppleTalk, or are they using some sort of split DNS? In other words, do they have internal DNS servers that give different form for their external? And will it give different information if you want to check for remote access possibilities? Now, in the footprinting process, you want to be very exhaustive. You might want to try and take out email addresses, server, domain name services, IP addresses, or even contact numbers. And you want to be very exhaustive with your approach. You don't want to miss anything out. Because if you do that, you can continue and also provide some launching points for additional attacks or tests that you may be able to do. But this is definitely a starting point of the types of information that you need to have as you go about footprinting your target. Now, next thing that we are going to see is very interesting. This is one of the many common tools that are out there on the internet, and that is the Wayback Machine, or also known as archive.org. Now, while it might not give you all the information that you need, but certainly gives you a starting point. And what we're talking about out here is the Wayback Machine, or archive.org. So let me just give you a quick look at what archive.org looks like. Okay, I already have it open out here. So out here, what you can see is how a website looked like around some time ago. So for example, if you want to look at what Google looked like, so you just have to search for Google out here and wait for results to come back. Okay, so we see that Google goes way back to 1998. So that was the last capture, or the first capture rather. It was the first capture by the Wayback Machine, and we can see that it has a screenshot of November 11th and how Google looked. So let's see what Google looked like in November 11th of 1998. So this is what Google looked like. There was actually nothing to it. It just said, "Welcome to Google, Google search engine prototypes," and it has some link. So yeah, this is what the Google search engine looked like. It had a Stanford search, it had a Linux search, and you could do all sorts of stuff. You could just put the results. Now, what I'm trying to tell y'all is you can see the evolution of a website through time through the Wayback Machine. And this gives you rather informative look into how website has actually evolved. Okay, now that we know what footprinting is and how it falls into the whole reconnaissance process, so let's go over a couple of websites to do a little bit of historical digging about companies and the types of infrastructure that they may be using. And this information, of course, is useful so that we can narrow down our focus in terms of what we want to target against them for attacks. Now, over time, we've improved our awareness about what sorts of information we may want to divulge. So several years ago, you may have gone to a company's website and discovered that you could get email addresses and names of people in positions that you may find relevant. And there were all sorts of bits of information that could be used against the company. And over time, we have discovered that those sorts of pieces of information probably don't belong on a website where they can be used against a company, and so they've been pulled off. Now, it used to be also that Google had the ability to pull up information that it had cached so far. For example, if a website was no longer available, or if it was temporarily down and offline, there was a little cache button that you could click when you did, and the Google search, and you could pull up that cached information. So even though the website wasn't available, you could still get information from Google's servers. Now, Google's removed that, so we don't have that ability any longer. However, there is an internet archive that we can use. So this thing is called the Wayback Machine, and I have it open out here. So it's archive.org/web. So archive.org is a website that gives us information about other websites and how they looked like in years ago. And by so, I'm going to go to the Wayback Machine, which you can see is at the archive.org, and I'm going to go and try and search for edureka.co. So now we're going to take a historical look at edureka.co's website. And you can see we've got some years, and they've got information going back up to 2013. So let's look at what this website looked like when it was just 2013. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any snapshots out here. I wonder what's going on. Okay, so let's go to 2014. And the first snapshot seems to be on the September 12th of 2014. Actually, it's on May 17th too. So let's see what that looked like. Okay, so this is what Edureka looked like back in 2013, or rather 2014, September 12th, 2014 to be actually exact. Now, you can see that we have some live classes and all these pictures are there, and they've got this weird picture of this guy out here. I don't know why that was a thing back in 2014. Now we can browse more advanced screenshots, or rather the screenshots that were taken later on, and see how this company has evolved with its infrastructure and the way it actually lays out its content. Okay, so it still hasn't evolved, but I can go a couple of years ahead and see what this has actually evolved into. So if I were to go to December 2016, so this is what it looked like in 2016, and we can see that they've added this weird box out here about browsing courses. They have added a search bar that kind of looks weird, but it's mostly because my internet is slow and it's not loading all the elements. They've also changed how they've actually laid out the courses. We can also see a change in the prices, I guess. So yeah, this tells us about how it evolves as a complete website. Now, this other website that I want to talk about is called Netcraft. Now, Netcraft does internet research, including the types of web servers that companies run. And they have a web server surveys. You can see here as we scroll that Apache Web Services has 64.3% of the internet market, of course, and that's followed by Microsoft with 13%. Interesting information, maybe useful information, but even more useful than that is looking at what different companies run for their websites. And you can see here. Okay, so let's try and search for edureka.co out here. So let's just put in the website URL and let Netcraft generate the site report. So as you can see that some of the stuff is not available. We know that the NetBlock owner is by Amazon Technologies. The name server is this thing right here. The DNS admin is AWS DNS host master. We also have the IP address. We can go for a virus, look up the IP on VirusTotal. We can do that. There is no IPv6 present, so that's some information that we can see. So we can obviously opt out to not target IPv6 ranges. Then there's also reverse DNS. Then we also have a bunch of hosting history. So this is a history of it. And we know that it's hosted on a Linux system with an Apache web server. And it was last seen, and this was when it was last updated. So this is some very useful information. You can also get information on stuff like Netflix. So if you just type, okay, I just spelled that wrong. So let me just change it from the URL out here. So if you go and type for netflix.com, and you'll see that it'll show you all sorts of information. So as you see that it's on an AWS server, it's an Amazon Data Services Ireland, and this is all the hosting history that it goes along with. It has some sender policy frameworks, domain-based message authentication, and reporting confirmations. And there's all sorts of information that you can get about websites and their web servers from Netcraft. So the Wayback Machine, along with Netcraft, make up for some interesting tools that are available on the internet, from which you can do a little bit of your reconnaissance process. Okay, now that we have gone over Netcraft and the Wayback Machine, now it's time to actually get to know how to use the little information that this site actually provides. So, what the next topic that we're going to go over is using DNS to get more information. Now, we're going to be going over a tool, and this is called Whois, and it is a utility that is used to query the various regional internet registries to store information about domain names and IP addresses. And let me just show it to you about all the internet registries that are there. So I have aaron.net open out here, and these are the internet registries that provides the ISPs and looks over the internet control as a whole. So out here we have Afrinic, we have Apnic, we have Aaron, we have Lacnic, and we have RIPE NCC. So these are all the regions and all the different types of stuff that they support, all the different countries. You can look at the map that it is supporting out here by just hovering over the providers. So as you can see, all these brown region out here is Africa, Afrinic. Then we have Apnic, which is this black or grayish thing, which is India and Australia and quite a lot of Asia. Then we have Aaron, which is a lot of North America and the United States mostly. Then is Lacnic, which is mostly the Latino side, which is the South American part. Then we have the rest of Europe, which is RIPE NCC, and this is the part that RIPE NCC is providing internet to. Okay, so that was all about the internet registries. Now let's get back to the topic, and that is using DNS to get more information. Now for this, we're going to be using a Linux-based system. So I have Ubuntu running on my virtual machine out here, and let me just log into it. So firstly, we are going to be using this query called Whois that looks up these internet registries that I just showed you. Let me just quickly remove this. Okay. So for querying information from the regional internet registries that I just talked about, you can use Whois to get information about who owns a particular IP address. So for example, I could do Whois, and let's see, I could do who is Google or rather Netflix.com, and we can get all sorts of information about Netflix. So we can see that we have the visit mark monitor. Then let's see, let's go up and look for all sorts of information that is being given to us by this Whois query. So as you guys can see, I just went a little bit too much. Okay, so registry domain ID. We have the domain ID where it is registered. The registered URL is mark monitor. Okay, so this is for marking actually. Now the creation date is 1997. So if you haven't realized, Netflix been around for a long time and it's been updated on 2015. And the registry expiry date, as we see, is 2019. So it's going to actually go off this year. Then this is all useful information. So we can see all sorts of domain status, the name server, the URL, the DNSSEC that it says unsigned. This is very useful information that is being provided by a very simple query. Now, if you want to know who owns a particular IP address, so let's see. Did we get back the IP address out there? We should have got back the IP address, but it's kind of lost on me. So to get back the IP address also for a domain name service that you know, so you could use this command called dig. So you dig netflix.com. Now, as you guys can see, that it has returned a bunch of multiple IP addresses. These are all the IP addresses that Netflix is. So I could do something like if I was trying to check out who owns a certain IP address, and for example, I have got one of these IP addresses, but let's just assume I don't know that it actually belongs to Netflix. So I can go who is 54.77.108.2, and it'll give me some information. So as you guys can see, it is giving us a bunch of information as to who this is and how it is happening. So we see that it is from Aaron.net, and so we can very smartly assume that it's from the North American part. Now, we can also see that it's in Seattle, so our guess was completely right. So it also gives us a range. So this is something very useful. So if you see, we now have the range of the IPs that might be being used by this guy. So we indeed have 54, and it says it goes up to the 54. There's also 34. Now let's check that out and see what information we get. So who is, and let's check it out. What was the IP that we were just seeing? It's 34.249.125.167. So 34.249.165. I don't know. Let's see. You can also put in a random IP address. It doesn't really matter, and it'll give you the information. So let's see. Is this in some IP address? Even this seems to be an Aaron IP address, and it's also based in Seattle. And we get a bunch of information. So that's how you can use the Whois query and the dig query to actually get all sorts of information about the domain name service and get information from a DNS basically. So now let's go over some theoretical part that is for DNS. So using DNS to get information. So firstly, what is a domain name service and why do we need it? So a domain name service is a name given to an IP address so that it's easy to remember. Of course, it's easy to remember names and mnemonics rather than a bunch of random weird numbers. Now, this was mainly so that we can map names to IP addresses and we can get a bunch of information from the hostname resolution. So that's the purpose of IP addresses. Now, we will also be looking at how to find network ranges. Okay, now before we get on to actually moving on to how to find out the network ranges, let me just show you how you can also use Whois. So Whois, suppose you want to know the domains with the word foo in it. So you could go whois foo. And this will give you a whole bunch of things about how foo exists and all the sorts of foos that there is on the internet. So that was one interesting flag. And if you want to know how to use more about Whois, you could just go dash dash help, I guess. Yeah, so this is all the types of stuff that we can do with Whois. So we can set the host, we can set the port that we want to search for. Then we can set with the L flag, we can find one level less specific match. And we can do an exact match, do an inverse lookup for specified attributes. Then we can also set the source. We can set verbose type, and we can choose for a request template. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff they can do. So you could suppose say who is verbose and suppose edureka.co. And it'll give you a verbose version of this is a RIPE database query service. The objects are in RPSL format. The RIPE database is subject to. So, okay, let's try something else like who is Netflix.com. Okay, I'm sorry. I was supposed to do verbose and I kept doing H. Silly me. So you do V and it'll give you a much more. Like this is a RIPE database. Again, I think I'm doing something wrong. Okay, just for that thing. Okay, V and type. Okay. Or let's just see. Let me just show you how to use it. Primary keys are returned. Only primary keys. Okay, let's see. Let's try that out. Okay, so it seems to be that this is a RIPE database query service, and the objects are in RPSL format, so it won't really work for that thing. And it also says that no entries found because it's this error. So this is for some later lesson. So for now, I hope I gave you a good idea of how to use whois. Like you could just go whois and some IP address like 192.168.101 or some gateway address like that. Or you could just go for a domain name service like Facebook and get all sorts of information about Facebook when the query actually returns you something. Okay, so let's move on to network ranges now. Now, in this part of the video, we're going to be going over the utility called whois, which is used for getting information from the DNS. Now, let me just show you a website out here. So this is the regional internet registries. So the internet registries are used to store information about domain names and IP addresses, and there are 5 regional internet registries. First is ARIN, which is responsible for North America, so that would be the US and Canada. Then we have LACNIC, which is responsible for Latin America and portions of the Caribbean. Then there's RIPE, that's responsible for Europe and Middle East and Central Asia. There's AFRINIC, which is responsible for Africa. And finally, we have APNIC, which is responsible for Asia Pacific Rim. So that's the regional internet registries. And as I said, whois is responsible for querying information from the various regional internet registries, as you can use whois to get information about who owns a particular IP address. So for example, let me just open up my Ubuntu system. Let me clear this out first. So as I was just saying, for example, you could go who is Facebook.com. Okay, so as you guys can see, we could find out pretty quickly about who owns a particular IP address. So for example, I could do whois and just go facebook.com. It tells me about who it belongs to. It also gives you who owns a particular IP address and who's responsible for them. From the information, you can get email addresses that belong to a particular company. This one has an email address for tech contact of ipreg@. So you can get all sorts of email addresses, tech contacts, and all sorts of stuff out there. The registry database contains only .com and .net and all sorts of information. Now, I want to query a different IP address and different information belongs in the different regional internet registries, of course. So if I want to go to a particular database, I would have to use the -h flag. So I could do who is Aaron net and remember the IP address, and I'm going to query that again. And of course, I get the same information back because I went there. So you could just go whois h and then follow it with an IP address. So something like 34.205.176.98. So that's just some random IP address I just made up. And it says that whois option. Okay, so it's a capital H. Okay, so let's see that. And we get all sorts of information back from that. So area 8, Aaron, and all sorts of stuff. Now I can get information about domains as well. So if I can query something like netflix.com and I can find out that this is that actually Netflix and there's an administrative contact and a technical contact, and you can see the different domain servers. So the servers that would have authority of information about the DNS entries for that particular domain. You can also see other information like when the record was created, and a whole bunch of different phone numbers that you can contact. And additional to storing information about IP addresses and domain names, sometimes it will store information about particular host names. And there may be other reasons why you would store a host name or particular information about a host name on the system with one of the RIRS. Now, if I wanted to look up something specifically, once I had found that, I could now do a lookup on whois, suppose, let's say, something like whois foo. So let's say whois foo. Now, if you already don't have whois installed, you can easily install it by just going apt install whois on your Unix system, and that should do the trick. And then you can start use this really nifty tool. Okay, so that was all about using whois. Now let's get on to actually using how to find out network ranges for a domain. Okay, so now let's talk about how we are going to be going over and finding network ranges. So suppose you've got an engagement and you only know the domain name and you don't know much beyond that. and you're expected to figure out where everything is and what everything is. So how do you go about doing that? Well, you use some of the tools that we either have been talking about or will soon be talking about in more detail. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the domain name edureka.co, and I'm going to look up edureka.co and see if I get an IP address back. So let's just head over there and go whoisedureka.co, or we could use the host keyword. So as you see, we get an IP address back, and that is 34.210.230.35, and that is the IP address. And you see that I've got back an IP address. So here's just an IP address, and I don't know what that IP address belongs to. I also don't know how big the network range or network block is, and that's associated with. So what I'm going to do is who is, and I'm going to look up with Aaron who owns that IP address. So you can basically go who is 34.210.230.35. So as you guys can see, that gives us a bunch of information and who is. Now, this doesn't seem to have a very big network range, but unlike something like Netflix, so suppose we were to do something like host netflix.com and see, now we have a bunch of IP addresses. So suppose we were to do who is, let's see, who is 52.19.40.147. Now I'm expecting Netflix to be a much larger company and have a better, yeah, now see, we get net range. So this is the network range that we're talking about. So we had a random IP address, and now we have found the network range. So that's how you find network ranges, and this can be very useful. So this gives me evidence that Netflix.com has a presence on different addresses. The one I have also located by looking up that particular host name. So I've got one address here that I can look at, and let's take a look at the website because that may be a different address. Now, if I didn't have that, I could also go and do something like an MX flag. So let's see. I could go dig, and this will give us all the mails. So dig MX, and let's see what MX does actually. You go help. So we could do dig-h for a list of options. So these are all the options that we have, and the one that we're going to use is something like this. So dig mx, and we say something like netflix.com. So these are all the mailings and MXs that we have gotten from Netflix, and this is information regarding it's still producing information. That's a big thing to produce. Okay, so as I was just saying, you can use the MX flag, and I could get back all the mail handlers in this case, and their mail is being handled by Google. And let's see, wait, let's go on to then it's going to tell me that Google's not particularly surprising, and other things that you can do is check for different host names, since I'm assuming DNS probably doesn't allow zone transfers, since most DNS servers don't anymore. Although they used to, you may have to start guessing, so I could do something like webmails that we find out here. So this shows us a dump of all the outstanding memory stuff. Okay, so that was all about finding network ranges. Now moving on to our next topic is using Google for reconnaissance. Now some people also call this Google hacking. Now if you know how to use Google to exactly target and find what you are looking for, Google is an excellent tool for reconnaissance purposes. And today I'm going to show you how you could use Google exactly for your searches. So first of all, let's open a tab of Google. Let's open up here. So let's go to google.com. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about how we can use Google to actually gain some information or some targeted information. So this is in general called Google hacking. Now, when I say Google hacking, I'm not meaning by breaking into Google to steal information. I'm talking about making use of specific keywords that Google uses to get the most out of the queries that you submit. So for example, a pretty basic one is the use of quotations. You quote things in order to use specific phrases. Otherwise, Google will find pages that have instances of all those words, rather than the words specifically together in particular order. So I'm going to pull this query up, and this shows a list of, let me just show it to you. So if you go index of, now this is showing us an index of all the films. Now this is basically all those index of sites that you want. So as you guys can see, this shows us an index of all sorts of films that are there. Now you can use the index of, and you see that we have also an index of downloads or something like that, hyphen.com/download. And it is an index of all sorts of stuff. Now you can go into some folder and check them out. G. Jones, G. Worthy, G. Perico. I don't know what these are, but some sort of stuff. And this is how you can use Google. Now let me just show you some more tricks. So you can use this. So suppose you're using Google to find for something like a presentation. So you could use something like file type PPTX. And it'll search for every type of file there that is PPT. Okay, let's try some other site, .ppt. So config. Okay, so this brings up all the types of files that have some configs in them. So this is some gaming configuration as we see. This is some digital configuration of Liverpool. Now you could also use something like this thing in URL, and you could use something like root, and this will give you all the things with root in their URL. So kingroot.n, digital trends, and how to root Android. So that's in the root. And suppose you want to say something like all in file type, or suppose you want some extension. So .ppt, .pptx, does that work? Let's search for JavaScript files. Okay, I think it's JS. Okay, that doesn't seem to work either. This shows us all the things with JS in it. No, it's just external JS. I'm doing this wrong. So you could use file type. So let's see, file type, and we go, see, doc. So these are all the documents that you could find with the file type thing. And you could also do JS, I guess. Yep, and this will give you all the JavaScript files that are there. So this is how you can use Google to actually narrow down your searches. So suppose you want a particular set of keyword, and we want to make sure we get the passwords file from Google. Okay, so now let's go into more details about the various things you can find using Google hacking techniques. Now, while Google hacking techniques are really useful for just general searching in Google, they're also useful for penetration testers or ethical hackers. You can narrow down information that you get from Google. You get a specific list of systems that may be vulnerable. So we can do things like look for error pages that do in the title error. So I'm going to get a whole bunch of information. So suppose like we go in title and we say error. So as that we get all sorts of stuff, and we can do the minus Google part. So if you do a minus Google, it'll not show you the stuff that's from Google. So we get various documentation pages about different vendors and the errors that they support. So here's one doc about Oracle, about Java error. If you know something more specific, we may be able to get errors about all sorts of other stuff. So this is how you could use the Google hacking technique to your own advantage if you're a penetration tester. Now let's also show you something called the Google hacking database. Now this is very useful for an ethical hacker. Now, the Google hacking database was created several years ago by a guy called Johnny Long, who put this Google hacking database together to begin to compile a list of searches that would bring up interesting information. Now, Johnny has written a couple of books on Google hacking, so we're at the Google hacking database website here, and you can see them talk about Google Docs and all sorts of stuff. Now, you can see that we can do all sorts of searches like in URL, SAP, BC, BSP. This brings up some portal pages. Now, out here, you can bring up some password, APS password in URL. Now, this will give you all sorts of stuff on Google. So suppose you go in URL, so like APS password. Now, you can get all sorts of stuff like which have passwords in their URL. So maybe you can just guess a password from there too. Now that was Google hacking. So Google hacking entries, and they also have a number of categories and that you can look through to find some specific things. So you may be interested in, of course, and you can search specific information that you may be looking for with regards to a specific product. For example, let me just show you exploit database. These are all the types of stuff you can go through out here. And as you see, we have all sorts of stuff like this is an SQL injection thing. This is something regarding peer archive tars. So these let you get a foothold into some password cracking attempts, and you can do some brute force checking. And you can see here if it talks about the type of search it is and what it reveals. You can just click here on Google search, and it will actually bring up Google with a list of responses that Google generates. So let's look at this one here. This type is a log. So this is something about cross-site scripting logs, and we can also see some potty logs if I was not wrong. So there's some denial of service POC, and we can see a bunch of stuff. And if you continue to scroll down, there are a lot of interesting information in here. So somehow somebody's got a potty log that has logged a lot of information. They've got it up on a website, and it's basically a bunch of information that you can see. You can also get some surveillance videos sometimes, and you can look into them. And this is basically how you could use Google. So it's basically a list of queries that you can go through, and this is a very useful site if you're a penetration tester and looking for some help with your Google hacking terminologies. So that's it for Google hacking. Now let's move on.